This is Gavin from ShearTac Tools. We're a Canadian-based company that provides woodworking and metalworking tools. And in this video, I'll be showcasing an installation and spiral cutter head replacement for the Delta 22580 planer. But first, make sure to unplug the machine before we start. I also recommend wearing gloves just to protect your hands. It's also a good idea to drop the table onto a piece of wood so that the cutter head won't rotate when we work on it. And so first, if you lift up this handle, you can have access to this bolt, and by removing it, you can remove the handle entirely. And on the other side, there's actually a blue knob that you can unscrew the screw, and you can remove the knob and the spring entirely. And once that's removed, the other remaining parts you can lift out, and just do be careful because there is a spring that can get lost pretty easily. So right here I'm just taking out the spring just to show that there is one. And once the top knobs are removed, you could look at these bolts that secure the top plastic panel to the rest of the planer. Same thing on the other side. You could see on the top there's also two other bolts that you can unscrew so you get access to the inside of the planer. So the way we actually get access to that, so get this front panel, you could lift it up, and the way I removed it is by pushing it away towards the feed roller as you see there. Same thing with the back panel. If you lift it up the same way, you could unlatch from where it's attached to the other two gray plastic pieces, just like I did there. And once the top panels are removed, the next step is to remove either one of these other metal gray panels. Then you can remove this left panel. Now to remove the panel on the right side, you first have to get rid of this handle. So unscrewing this bolt gives you access to that panel. And once it's removed, you can simply lift up the black panel on the right side. Then you're going to want to remove these two screws. These are what hold the cover for the cutter head belt. With that removed, you should be able to just pull it off. Now the belt is very tight, and to release some of that tension, I'm unscrewing one of these bolts to release tension in the belt. And as you'll see here, the belt is pretty loose, so it will make it easier to walk the belt off of both pulleys. As you see here, I'm just walking it off. And now on the other side, these two bolts secure this plastic cover holding the gear assembly in place. And now what I'm holding here are some snap ring pliers. Available at sheartac.com, you can use these to remove any snap rings or retaining rings holding one of these sprockets in place. Now these snap rings allow the sprocket not to come off of each of the shafts that it's on. After those snap rings are removed, I can remove both sprockets attached by chain together at the same time. And now after that, there is actually one more hidden snap ring underneath this gear assembly, and I'm going to use the same technique with some of the snap ring pliers just to remove that retaining ring. And in this clip, I'm just removing each of the bolts and bolt covers that attach the gearbox assembly together. Now in my case, I accidentally took apart the entire gearbox assembly. But if this happens to you, don't worry, because at the end of the video, I showcase the entire reassembly of the machine start to finish. Now I wanted to remove the back panel of the gearbox assembly because it's still attached. So I actually had to remove this blue sort of handle that controls the speed. So I'm using an Allen key just to remove the bolt that attaches that handle to the gear inside. And I also took apart this cover that holds the wire in place just to get access to the back panel of the gearbox assembly. Now to remove this nut, I first had to drop the entire table assembly down to that piece of wood to hold that cutter head in place. I don't want it rotating as I try to remove the nut. Another thing to note, it's actually left-hand threaded, which is why I'm turning it clockwise to loosen it. So now my next problem is that this pulley at the cutter head is pretty tight, which is why I'm using this bearing puller. It works both for bearings but also for pulleys or gears. This is available at sheartack.com if you need it. And by twisting the lead screw, it actually just pulls that pulley out of its shaft, which is pretty easy. So both the snap ring pliers and this bearing puller I just used, I'll link in the description of this video. Another thing to note is that this key at the keyway of the cutter head shaft, you want to be careful not to lose it as it's very important. And then next, you're just going to want to remove this bolt because there's no way to pull the cutter head out of the planer without taking this piece off. Then you're going to remove these 3 bolts that secure that bearing cover to the rest of the planer. Okay, now we're almost there. If you turn your planer over, you can locate these 2 holes that cover the lead screws. They contain 2 sprockets and a chain that actually lift the entire cutter head assembly up and down. Now I'm still looking at the bottom of the planer. You can start removing this metal fence, and these are actually Torx screws, and I'm using this T-shaped Torx wrench available at sheartack.com to remove each of those Torx screws. And as you can see here, I'm just pulling away the metal fence. And I'll do the same thing for the other side. And again, using the same T-shaped Torx wrench available at sheartack.com, I can remove each of those screws that secure this metal fence in place. Now if you flip the planer over again, I'm going to start to remove this black cover. I just need to remove it so that I could get more access to the cutter head, and you'll see in a second why I need to take it off. And with the vent cover removed, I can remove this metal frame that's holding the cutter head in place, or the last thing that's blocking it at least. So once I take off that frame, I could then remove this spring. Just make sure not to lose both of these items. If you do notice, this machine is already pre-equipped with a spiral cutter head, but for demonstration purposes, I'll show you how to remove it. If you see there, I used a metal bushing to hammer it out from the opposite side, to hammer out that cutter head from this side. Here's a top-down view of what I did. Again, make sure to wear gloves as protection, as the carbide inserts or the old cutter head inserts you may have are pretty sharp. So I used again a metal bushing available at sheartack.com to hammer out the cutter head. So I used a combination of the metal bushing and a mallet to hammer it out. Now if this is your old cutter, you can then take off this bearing cover because you still need it on your machine. So there are 2 screws attached, and by simply removing those, you can then replace it with whatever new cutter head you have. Once you do have the new cutter head installed, simply slide it back through the large opening at the cutter head hole and just slide it back until it stops. And when doing this, you want to make sure to align the bearing cover holes to the threaded holes as seen here. And I'm using this piece of wood just to protect the cutter head shaft, and I'm just using a mallet to hammer it in. And again, just to emphasize, you want to make sure that those holes are lined up with the threaded holes as you hammer it in. But here you can see that the screws don't really fit well through the holes since I didn't align it perfectly. So in this situation, you want to use a combination of a wooden, like a piece of plywood and a mallet, and I'm just using it to align it properly. And from that point on, I was able to add the screws back into place. And now retracing our steps, we can actually reattach the screw to the metal cover from previously, and we can attach it right back where it was. Make sure you don't forget the spring, as that's quite important. I put it right into this hole, and you can follow the steps backwards. You'll know if you installed it correctly if you can push down on the cover and it springs up nicely. Back to the top of the planer, we can reattach the black cover, this black ventilation cover, and using those two same bolts, I want to install it in the same place as before. As I highlighted with my hands there, you want to make sure that the opening of that vent cover meshes well with the spongy material at the back. And after that, you can screw back these knobs into place, holding that vent cover. At the bottom, once again, you want to reattach those metal frames that we removed earlier. And just make sure to repeat this for the other side as well. These next steps are also pretty crucial. You want to make sure to add the cover for this chain and sprockets as well, because these are actually what make the both lead screws at both ends. They're actually what lift the cutter head up and down. Now your machine should have bolts securing the sprockets to the lead screws that it's attached to. Just make sure to reattach those since I can't demonstrate that here. And just reattach the bottommost cover and just secure it with the two screws that it came with. If you did also remove this wire cover, just make sure to put it back in place before anything else. Here you'll notice a pinion gear. This is actually what connects the speed handle. It's what controls the speed. So it actually connects to this shaft at the gearbox. This is the rack that attaches to that pinion. If you see that there's actually a keyway right here, actually a key, and it fits into the keyway into the right here. So as I'm putting in that rack, I'm pushing the back panel of the gear assembly and making sure it meshes well with the gear at the back. And next we can reattach this gear that goes into the Cutterhead shaft. This is on the same side of the gearbox. And once that's completed, make sure to match up the holes of the gearbox to the threaded holes of the planer. So the first gear we'll be attaching is this one. It has a flat side on one end, and that's what actually meshes with the back of the panel. As you see here, the flat end of it without the gear, that's what actually attaches to the same side of the planer. And you'll notice there are two gears that are pretty similar. The one with the bigger holes is the one you want. And the side that is flat, similar to the first gear, that's the one you want to mesh with the back panel of the gearbox assembly. And with those attached, we can attach these two sprockets and chain. These are the ones that connect both of the feed rollers, the in-feed and out-feed rollers. Just make sure that the key and keyway of each sprocket and shaft pair match up. And if you did this correctly, roll one of the feed rollers and you should see both of them roll. Now the third gear, make sure to note the smaller end. The smaller gear is what meshes with the back panel. And so now for the fourth gear, you want the side with the head, so the not flat side, so as highlighted here, you want this side facing the back panel, so opposite the first one with the bigger holes, as seen in here, this clip. And to check if you did everything correctly, if you spin the feed rollers, only the chain should move, and if you spin the cutter head, only the gears should move. You don't want these two pieces interfering. And now we can reattach the retaining ring on the shaft with the sprocket. The sprocket that we want to attach it on is just the one on the right side. And again, I'm just simply using some snap ring pliers to just easily get that retaining ring around the shaft. Again, make sure if you did this correctly, if you pull on the sprocket, it should not come off. Then you can put this black spacer on the shaft on the left side. And once that's complete, we can replace that gearbox front cover. We can just put it back onto that shaft. We won't be able to put it on all the way, which is why we're using again a metal bushing and a mallet to hammer it in. We want the bearing to be press fitted onto that shaft. And in this clip, I'm just getting those plastic spacers and making sure I put them each on the individual holes of the gearbox assembly. Just make sure to put the bolts and the spacers exactly where I have in this clip. Once that's completed, we can get the big sprocket and chain. We make sure to put the larger sprocket on the bottom left side and the smaller one on the top side. We're going to use the chain to connect both of them and rotating it as we need, just so that the key matches the keyway of one of the shafts. And if you did that correctly, if you spin the chain, both of the chains should spin. And now we're going to get back with the snap ring pliers, and I'm going to get that retaining ring, and I'm just going to reattach it to the upper shaft here. I'm making sure to press it in and making sure that the sprocket does not fall out. Here's just a closer view of what that looks like. So I'm using a retaining ring and the snap ring pliers, and just for a close-up view, this is how it works. I'm going to get it around the shaft, make sure to press it in, and once it's in, it should not allow the sprocket to come off of the shaft. That's what it's there for. And using snap ring pliers makes this process much easier. And once that's done, we can reattach this blue speed control handle with this bolt, making sure that when we tighten it, it does go back and forth between dimensioning and finishing. And once we have the key from the keyway of the Cutterhead, we can just put it back. That's what allows torque to transfer between the pulley to the Cutterhead. And here I'm just putting back that metal pulley and using a piece of wood and a mallet just to hammer it in. Now, since I lifted the Cutterhead assembly up all the way, I can't use that same piece of wood. So I'm using a small piece of plywood to jam the Cutterhead so that I can get some torque on this nut. And again, it's left-handed, so turning it counterclockwise actually tightens it. Once that's complete, we need to reattach this bolt. This is very crucial for tensioning the belt. Now it's not tensioned yet, so I'm going to use the belt and I'm going to walk it on both of the pulleys. So I'm using this technique of just walking it on, and while it's not under much tension, I can do it so with ease. And now with my left hand, I'm pulling up on the motor, and with my right hand, I'm tensioning the screw. And this is what's going to allow it to tension the belt. It needs to stay under tension to allow the force of the motor to be transferred to the Cutterhead. If you did it correctly, if you squeeze the edges of the belt, it should stay under tension as seen here. And so the next step, I'm going to put the screws back in place here, and that's just going to be the cover. So I'm going to put back that black plastic cover to cover that belt. And I'm going to do something similar at the side of the gearbox. If you notice, these two holes are empty. I can use the black cover, and I'm going to use these two bolts and a ratchet just to secure it into place. Now the side panels were pretty self-explanatory, but I just wanted to go over how to assemble the top side again. So if this is the top of the planer, you want to make sure that the letters are facing you. But since I forgot, I just want to show in this video. So there is a logo with the Delta logo on it, and on the back side of this panel, I want that to match up to the sides as seen here. So I'm pointing at this one and the one on the right. I'm going to attach it on those first. By attaching it that way, the top panel on the front meshes nicely. And same for the back panel. On the back side, there are these two areas to drop it into, and it should drop in nicely with no problems. And so there you have it. You finally replaced your old Cutterhead with a new spiral Cutterhead for the Delta 22580 benchtop planer. And that's it. Order your spiral Cutterhead now at sheartac.com or any of the other tools that we used in this video.